So thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today.
Thank you too for having me.
And what is your name and what is your position in the Philippines and for the Philippine people?
I'm Jose Maria Sison. At the moment, I'm the chairperson of the International League of People's Struggle and also consultant, chief political consultant of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. I left the Philippines after I went back to the university.
So tell me about what's been happening with the National Democratic Front under Duterte.
Well, it was founded on April 24, 1973. I was present and participated in the founding process of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines.
And is this the same as the Communist Party of the Philippines?
The Communist Party of the Philippines is, of course, different from the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. The NDF is a united front formation. So it's not only the Communist Party that is a member, but it is among several other members. At the moment, there are 17 other organizations that are allied under the umbrella of the NDF.
And since many of the people watching this film will be Americans, and they have they don't have a very positive view of communism. So can you explain what communism is as far as you're concerned and how you would like to apply it in the Philippines?
Well, there is the theory of Marxism-Leninism, and it's supposed to be applied on the concrete conditions in the Philippines. And there are as many as 3 stages in social development involving huge revolutionary changes. The struggle being led by the Communist Party is well rooted in the concrete conditions of the Philippines. When I say concrete conditions, these are describable as semi-colonial and semi-feudal, and this is problematic. The solution is a national democratic revolution of the new type, that means to say led by the working class. And only after the basic completion of this national democratic revolution would it be possible to proceed to the socialist revolution. And it would take some time to reach communism in the long process of building socialism. So communism will be some kind of a third stage. And it's not communism that is being applied in the Philippines. It is a long-term goal. And I may never come to see how the communist society will be realized. We can only make projections theoretically.
So what would you say about Russia, formerly Russia? Would you say that was a communist society?
Russia, when it was still the core of the Soviet Union, or rather, let me look at the Soviet Union from 1917 to 1956. We would consider it socialist in character. But after 1956, you have already the bourgeoisie camouflaging itself as communist, having taken over state power already under Khrushchev. So the Communist Party of the Philippines has been critical of of the Soviet Union since 1956. And we, as proletarian revolutionaries who would re-establish the Communist Party of the Philippines in 1968, had been on the side that you may call Marxist-Leninist, together with the Communist Party of China, in denouncing Soviet modern revisionism and Soviet social imperialism. So we are not at all surprised when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. There was nothing disappointing about it.
And how can you ensure that, as so often happens, the whatever the social system is, certain individuals, certain families, certain corporations grab the power through many tricky means, be it they sneaky or downright violent? How do you ensure that that does not happen?
Well, there is what you call the epochal struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie. This cannot be resolved, say, in a number of few centuries. As we have seen, the communist movement as a revolutionary force had made outstanding achievements from the time that the Communist Manifesto was issued. Only a few decades it would lead to Marxism being the main trend in the labor movement in the 19th century, just before, in the last decade of the 19th century. Then, 1917, the October Revolution would occur in Russia, and when fascism arose in Europe, first in Italy and in Germany, it would appear as if communism, referring to it in a very general way, was finished because Hitler was so successful, and then he would attack the Soviet Union. But World War II would lead to bigger conflagration against the capitalist cause. So, well, when you come to 1956, 1/3 of humanity was already governed by working class parties in societies that you might consider socialist or People's Democratic. But then it was also that year when Khrushchev and his crew were able to take over power in the Soviet Union, and in a way, even the Chinese Revolution of 1949 was already overtaken by the rise of revisionism. You know, tens of thousands of Chinese workers, trainees, and students were sent to the Soviet Union and would become influenced by revisionism. That would be a problem for Mao in succeeding decades. But you know, this is the way I look at history. I look at the undulations, the swings of history in terms of 50 years, 100 years. But I just cannot accept that the working class and the rest of the exploited will just accept, you know, capitalism to persist forever. There's no such thing. When we look at the earlier social formations, they had time limits and they had even longer lives. But the problem of capitalism, it really brings about its grave diggers and the conditions by which it can be replaced by socialism. Capitalism, as it involves the competition of capitalist monopolies of different countries, and as it, you know, it cannot help but to win in the competition. The level of technology has always to be raised, and this leads to the crisis of overproduction, then futile attempts are made to save the capitalist economy by using finance capital. So recently, you must be familiar with the bailouts, which are now going to be the source of a big problem because public debt has risen to an explosive level. The global debt is already $247 trillion, and it is 318% of the global GDP. So it would seem as if it is frustrating that the so-called big socialist countries have turned capitalist, both Russia and China. But they have joined the top round of the capitalist powers, and they're competing. So new conditions are developing. At first, you'd think that, as Buffett would put it, he accepts that there is a class struggle and it's a bourgeoisie winning. Indeed, it seemed like the bourgeoisie, especially the US, had won since 1991. But the new problem for the capitalist system is that there is an increase of imperialist vultures, imperialist monsters competing. And since 2008, they cannot solve not all the multilateral agencies and the G7 or G8 or OECD could solve the problem. So there are now new conditions which generate resistance from the people, and the Philippine revolutionary struggle has a very special place now because it is continuing to uphold the flag of revolution, although it's still new, democratic revolution led by the working class. And I think the Communist Party of the Philippines is leading a revolution that inspires the working class elsewhere. And right there in Asia, you have a big country like India, and there is a growing Maoist-led revolutionary movement there. And we anticipate, in modesty, that for every big nodal point in the struggle between the working class and the bourgeoisie, in connection with World War I, you have a big country like Russia being the stage of the world revolution. Then, in connection with World War II, China arose as the big country where revolution was carried out towards socialism. And I suppose India could be the next big stage for the revolution. So anyway, you have now a US supposedly in command of the world capitalist system, but it is in a rapid strategic decline. And so, it's still number one economic and military power, but it has to take into account the other capitalist powers in making decisions and undertaking operations against the oppressed peoples and the working people.
So, regarding socialist countries recently, what do you think about what happened in Venezuela?
What do you think is now happening in Venezuela?
Venezuela. Venezuela raised the flag of socialism but you might say it was good at funding social services, generating some employment and making buildings for people to live in and provide healthcare. But I doubt it that you can really say that Chavez was able to make a socialist revolution, because he did not knock down or knock out the exploiting classes. And so they can come back, and so there's now a reaction against Maduro and the entire tradition of Chavismo. Well, I appreciate the Venezuelan people, led by Maduro, in trying to keep up the spirit of Chavismo, because it's still better than any other situation in a similar country. But Venezuela is dependent on the oil income. It was because the old exploiting classes, the big compradors and landlords were never thrown out of power completely. So they could not undertake real social revolution.
So how, since money seems to be controlling almost everything, how can, and you said that Chavez was not able to knock out the ruling elite, how can that be done?
Hindi ko kuha.
Kasi alam mo, yung isang tanong niya is once makuha natin ng power, how can we make sure that it will not turn just like what happened in Russia and China? Yun yung mahaba mong diniscuss eh. Now, the question is, in Venezuela, how was it that, how could you,
Or more like
exploited, how could exploited maintain itself in power when there are so many oppressors of many imperialist powers?
and how and specifically in the Philippines.
Specifically in the Philippines.
Yeah. How could it be possible to have a, well, first of all, what is the difference between socialism and communism?
Yun ang tanong. What is that?
Well, you have a communist party that will always try hard to stay as the agency of the people's revolution. What is important about the new democratic revolution, even if it is trying at first to complete what we call the unfinished revolution in the Philippines, is that the working class comes out as the leading class and leads the People's Army that overthrows the neo-colonial regime that is puppet to U.S. imperialism. So what is essential here, unlike the old democratic revolution which started in 1896, this no longer led by the ilustrados, the so-called enlightened ones from the bureaucracy, the merchant class, not even from an industrial class, no? Now you have the working class in command of the revolution through, by being in command of the People's Army, and it has the main state power, the main instrument of state power in its hands. So it can guarantee the follow-up in the form of the socialist revolution. The class leadership in society changes. And of course, there are always pitfalls in the rise of a new working class. Take the case of the bourgeoisie the bourgeoisie did well in making the French Revolution. But in France, it was only in the 1920s when, after the empire building of Napoleon and the monarchies, it would take some time before you have really universal suffrage and women's suffrage and everything that are supposed to be guaranteed by bourgeois democracy. So the proletarian revolution also goes through twists and turns in history. And what is a good thing about the Chinese Revolution led by Mao, although it has been frustrated by the Dengist counter-revolution, is that before Mao Zedong thought, or Maoism was reversed by then, it demonstrated for at least 10 years how to carry out a struggle against modern revisionism, prevent the restoration of capitalism, and consolidate socialism. So there is something to build on, like the failure or the defeat of the Paris Commune of 1871, that would provide lessons to Lenin, lessons which would serve the October Revolution very well. So we learn from history in very simple terms. It's very easy to pinpoint now the corruption of the mentality as well as corruption through acquisition of things. When people, let's say, even workers, even children of workers and peasants, after they get education, they join the party only to go up the bureaucratic ladder, and pretty soon they forget about their working class origins, and they become at least petty bourgeois, and then of course they like to see things that seem to be more advanced in the West, no? But what's good about the temporary setback or strategic setback of socialism in the conversion of socialist Russia or Soviet Union and China, is that the West, which had a big start in technological development, this has resulted in the dissemination of the technology. You don't see eventually in the forthcoming socialist countries, they will no longer be impressed by tourists bringing video cameras and all those electronic gadgets, which used to impress. You remember, even only cameras produced en masse by the West would impress the East Germans, and so the East Germans bring vegetables to West Berlin, and they come back with those gadgets and no income for the state and for the whole people. So, but now the technology is widespread, and I think if the Philippine Revolution would succeed, it can access the technology from the competing capitalist powers. So there is a wide area for maneuver this time.
You talked about the People's Army doing an overthrow. Is that actually possible, especially if the U.S., which does have I think the biggest military in the history of ever, if the U.S. is backing Duterte, is it possible to win through military, and is that the best way to win? Through military?
The U.S., through its puppets, has done practically everything to fight and defeat the new People's Army. The only thing the US has not done is to engage in all-out war of aggression, as in Vietnam. But we must take note that a 14-year fascist dictatorship of Marcos and, campaigns of suppression from Marcos to Duterte have failed to destroy the movement. Waging a people's war is also a process of creation. It's not just, annihilating the forces of the others. Of course, that is necessary in order to strengthen the People's Army. And it is necessary because the People's Army guarantees the existence of certain new things created by the revolution. To be brief about it, there is now People's Democratic Government of workers and peasants in the country. There are now two governments in the Philippines. Of the workers and peasants based in the countryside, and the one headed by Duterte in Manila. So this people's power, governmental and mass, would grow wave upon wave until it squeezes out the upper layers of the comprador landlord government. So, you have to take it from the national security officers and from Duterte himself. He still considers the Communist Party and the New People's Army as the biggest threat to the security of that kind of state.
Is there any non-violent way of having a revolution in the Philippines?
Well, the essential thing taught by Marxism, especially something proven in the Paris Commune, that if you are not consistent in upholding the rule of the proletariat, before you know it, the bourgeoisie would come back and knock you down and put you out and massacre you. So, indeed, you have to arouse, organize, and mobilize the people. You have to they have to exercise their democratic rights, put forward the demands, and if the demands are violently suppressed by the ruling class, then there is no, then the justice in using revolutionary violence would be justified. Now, the violence actually comes from the ruling class, the big compradors and landlords. You see, without the working people fighting back, the ruling class uses this system of exploitation as a system of violence. And according to the Bible, there is daily violence in exploitation. So, and that precedes the people's violent resistance. So, the big comprador landlord class resorts to many peaceful tactics, aside from using violent means to suppress the revolutionary movement. So, therefore there will be twists and turns because, the two sides try to do their best in outwitting the other side and using the means by which to defeat the other side. The enemy would use also supposed democratic means and ways to mislead the people. So in the Philippines, you have the change of regimes, but you have the same ruling class of big compradors and landlords, from Marcos to the current regime. And it turns out this Duterte was able to win because he was able to forge an alliance with the worst dynasties in Luzon, no? he used to decry the imperialism of Manila, but he got his 14 percentage points from the Marcoses, the Arroyos, Estrada, and so on. He had, of course, his bailiwick vote of some 25%, his Visayan bailiwick on the central part of Visayas and Mindanao.
And so have you been part of negotiating for the NPA with Duterte?
Yes, as chief political consultant of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, I have taken part in the peace process. And the NDFP has been sincere about negotiating because, Duterte put himself forward or proclaimed himself as left and socialist. He said that he wanted to become the first left president of the Philippines, and of course he had a background of cooperating with the revolutionary movement in his home region. So he was given a chance, a whole year chance to prove that he meant what he said. The movement, the revolutionary movement is open to having a government, even if it involves, cessation of hostilities for an extended period, or at least for the duration of a truly democratic government, at least more democratic. And then, the kind of government perpetuated and run by, the traditional politicians representing the exploited classes, that's where the peaceful way may be given a chance too. But then, as it has turned out, I've been participating in the peace negotiations since 1992, when it was formalized here in The Hague, with the framework agreement on peace negotiations, the so-called The Hague Joint Declaration. But we noticed that the only thing the regime is interested in is, having a protracted ceasefire. And they think that when they get it, then they don't deal with the substantive issues involving social, economic, and political reforms. The NDM just wants to have the social and economic reforms, comprehensive agreement, and it can give way to prolonged ceasefire. The Filipino communists are sometimes proud of the fact that relatively the Philippine Revolution is gentle compared to other revolutions. When it is said 40,000 were killed, most of those people killed were actually civilians killed by the military. You can only say probably up to 10,000 maybe for the NPA to build its current strength. It caused some casualties, anywhere from 8 to 10,000. That's how gentle it is. So the Communist Party of the Philippines is willing to go into a peaceful phase so long as major social, economic, and political reforms are made, and so the non-violent ways can be given full play.
Is there a way to ensure, if there is a full communist revolution, that the state does not, now that we have technology, now that people could vote on their computers, now that people could be more informed and there isn't, the communication is open. Would it be possible to have a communist revolution with the outcome being that the state is not intruding in people's lives, or that people still feel a sense of freedom?
And the general line of the revolutionary struggle is to seek the realization of national independence and democracy. Well, by national independence, we have to do away with certain treaties, agreements and arrangements which bind us to the United States. U.S. still the #1 imperialist power, and the Philippines can have genuine independence through the assertion of the sovereign will of the Filipino people. And then when it comes to democracy, it's possible to have some kind of arrangement in which the bourgeoisie is not eliminated. For instance, there is the national bourgeoisie in the Philippines which can be favored and can still be a positive force for industrial development. It has ambitions which could to build an industrialized Philippines, and there's no problem to the Communist Party about that. As a matter of fact, in land reform, the Communist Party of the Philippines is willing for the enlightened landlords, for the cooperating landlords, to receive payments for the land, so long as the payment is fair enough and affordable, and the landlords can be induced to make investments in the industrial field. So even the landlords are not completely being completely smashed, so long as they come to terms on a revolutionary program. Land reform is a bourgeois democratic measure anyway. It's not yet a socialist measure, so it's something within the range of democracy to make allowances for the exploiting classes, so long as they change their ways and adopt new methods of investment.
What can be done so there is a change of heart of people, meaning that people, like if you take the word communism, it's communal, meaning people caring about the group instead of just about themselves. What can be done so that there's an actual change of heart within the country, especially with those who currently have the power, and the people, the workers who take over? Because remember, just because people are oppressed doesn't mean that when they have power, they're not going to oppress others, because we've seen that many times. So what can be done to change the heart?
Considering the 50 years of struggle and attempts of the Communist Party to raise the consciousness and the level of organization and level of mobilization of the people, I think the people have come to know what is the solution to their basic problems. You cannot instruct the people on what problems they suffer from. As a matter of fact, revolutionaries go to them to learn from them, to know in the concrete how the problems work against them. So I never take the level of consciousness of the workers and peasants at a certain level at a given time as problem. What is problematic is, the ruling class controls the government, it controls the means of information and communication. There is a lot of anti-communism. So right away the military and politicians of the Duterte type will frighten people. Oh, everything will be taken away from you, including all your items of personal consumption, including your toothbrush and so on. People are made to feel that they're going to lose everything. But I think the old anti-communist stuff it would be laughed at by so many people. I would even say that our peasant leaders, who are even more intelligent and better educated by the Communist Party of the Philippines than the bourgeois professors in the university. They have both the anti-imperialist learning and at the same time the experience, real the masses will just accept what the tyrants would impose. But then at this time, with the Communist Party providing the background, the insights in the present and the foresight, I think people are well equipped to arm themselves with the revolutionary consciousness. And then, of course, it's necessary for the people to maintain their revolutionary vigilance because it's unavoidable that they put up this, governmental structures. And of course, it's always problematic. 5% of the population is Communist Party members. When it comes to power, it's practically what you might call a rule of the few. So I've been thinking that maybe like Christendom succeeded, like Christianity succeeded in having Christendom, from the baptism onwards. Something like that can be done by the Communist Party. The membership of the Communist Party can be loosened, and then the people will not just be an amorphous mass before impressive party and state leaders. So even the very instruments of ruling can be democratized to the point that people can express, can criticize and express their will. No? There can be changes in if you look at the socialist states that have come about, they have only a small part of the population becoming communist. And so, let's say in Russia, overnight, the Orthodox Church takes over. It's Putin's church, no? And right now China is using Confucius because Confucius has a pre-communist and post-communist influence. Education of the people in socialism and everything that it takes to build socialism should be well done, and people should be able to check those who are entrusted with the responsibilities of governance.
So transparency.
Yeah.
Okay, anything else you want to say?
Anything else you want to say?
Yeah, it's as you wish, no? Of course, we will be going over old ground probably if we talk about IPT, Duterte regime. No? You brought the discussion to a higher level.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Yes?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, too.